By many standards, he was an even greater prodigy than Mozart. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was born into a well-to-do family, although his parents had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism before his birth. From a young age, Mendelssohn gravitated towards softer sounds, and much of his written music indicates this preference as well. He had 3 siblings, all of whom were precocious in their own way, but he was especially close to his sister Fanny, who was fully literate by the age of 3.5. Mendelssohn wasn't just a fan of music, a field in which he was, naturally, a prodigy. He also did really well athletically. He also liked drawing and was really enthusiastic about physical fitness, possibly because his family was friends with the father of modern gymnastics. By age 8, Mendelssohn was transposing piano etudes at sight, and soaked up all of the information that his teacher, Carl Zelter, could give him. Zelter grounded the young prodigy in the methodology of Johann Sebastian Bach, and took it upon himself to zealously correct the young student's sometimes sloppy counterpoint assignments. At one point, Felix took up the violin just so he could impress Zelter at a lesson. This emphasis on Bach sort of ran in the family. Believe it or not, there was a point in which Bach was considered just this endless mathematical note spinner whose music lay incomprehensible to the masses. But the Mendelssohns loved them some Bach, and this wasn't just the Lutheran side of the family either. They kept that a secret. In fact, Felix's first exposure to the St. Matthew Passion came through his Jewish grandmother. Yet despite her appreciation of what is undoubtedly the greatest Lutheran music of all time, and possibly the greatest Christian music of all time, Mendelssohn's grandmother actually wrote the family out of her will whenever she discovered their secret conversion to Lutheranism. The irony was not lost on Mendelssohn when he later revived this piece, but more on that in a minute. It was due to this well-rounded admiration of Bach that Mendelssohn began writing his clefs like the great master. Now, everyone thinks of Mozart as the greatest prodigy who ever lived, but when you compare Mendelssohn's work from a certain age to Mozart's work from an equivalent age, you find that Mendelssohn is actually producing a consistently higher quality work, and first forays into given genres also likewise favor Mendelssohn. From 11 to 14, Mendelssohn experienced an incredible burst of creativity, which culminated in his first symphony at age 15, his famous string octet at 16, and his Midsummer Night's Dream Overture at 17. He sought to complete his musical education, but he found that many composers he sought out thought that they had nothing that they could teach him. He took full advantage of his family's wealth. At age 12, he wrote a Singspiel, basically an opera with some spoken dialogue in between the numbers, and they had it produced quite literally in-house. When he went to Paris, his father urged him to drop his last name in favor of a much less Jewish Bartholdy. However, the most Felix used that name was in conjunction with his actual surname, leading to Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, which kind of defeated the entire point that his father wanted to do by supplanting his last name in the first place. And although he was not Jewish in belief, his sacred music reveals a deep inspiration from the Old Testament. Mendelssohn's introduction to the elderly poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe finally put the last nail in the coffin in the argument of who was the greater prodigy, as many intellectuals and other musicians of the time turned to the aged Goethe to finally settle the debate once and for all. Goethe said that what Mendelssohn was doing dwarfed Mozart's equivalent accomplishments. At one gathering, Goethe actually put Mendelssohn on the spot in a series of grueling musical trials, which culminated in reading a Beethoven sonata from manuscript. Now, Beethoven was known to have really sloppy handwriting, so being able to just decipher this thing at all is wow. Mendelssohn's ability to memorize music was enormous and prodigious. At one point, when a friend was complaining that Beethoven's 7th Symphony was overrated, Mendelssohn decided to replicate it right then and there on the piano from memory, just because that's just sort of the thing he did. However, despite his many successes, he did endure his fair share of failure, mostly in the realm of opera. His one opera, not Singspiel, was based off of a very obscure episode in Don Quixote, and its subsequent flop made him really wary of both librettists and critics. Throughout the rest of his life, he remained in continued search for a workable opera libretto. and he even started a few other operas before breaking them off for one reason or another. He was called simply too acute to actually find a good libretto. His standards were just too high. Now, what made Mendelssohn a really great early romantic was his inspiration that came from song. Specifically, his incorporation of vocally inspired melodic lines in purely instrumental music. Now, most famously, this manifested itself in a series of pieces he wrote over his entire career that he called Lieder ohne Worte, or Songs Without Words. Some of the earliest pieces in these collections were actually contributions to his opuses by his sister Fanny, and her pieces were sometimes singled out as the best of the bunch. The double stigma of female composer and high society composer meant that Fanny's accomplishments really weren't acknowledged until the very end of her life. One of Mendelssohn's defining traits as a musician was his high expectations for others. He traveled throughout Europe, accruing inspiration for later pieces, but often found the status of musical life in the places that he visited incredibly lacking, and he complained about everything from the parallel fifths of Swiss folk music to the sad state of choral music in Rome. This latter disillusionment actually probably was the basis of his friendship to Hector Berlioz, who was probably one of the weirdest figures in all of Romanticism. That the religious and reserved Mendelssohn could be friends in any way, shape, or form with the atheistic blowhard Berlioz is a minor miracle in and of itself. In fact, Mendelssohn said that Berlioz was more sensible than his music, and a stereotyped genius in black and white, despite disliking his music immensely. To be fair, Berlioz couldn't stand Mendelssohn's music either, so I really highly doubt that any part of their friendship was based on, similar musical philosophies. One of the only places in Europe in which he fit really nicely into musical culture was in London, though England was known as the land without music, since no English composer had gone on to international renown since Henry Purcell. In fact, speaking of Purcell, Mendelssohn actually had to go into damage control mode when he accidentally revealed to a Belgian critic that he didn't think much of Purcell's music, despite the fact that he and the critic both agreed that Purcell's music sucked. When Mendelssohn was 20, he went forward with his plan to revive the St. Matthew Passion. Now, he and members of his circle had pulled out chorales from the Passion before, to be performed with good amateur choirs, just so they could get a glimpse of what Bach's music sounded like. However, a combination of the piece's length and the forces required, not to mention the sheer quality of musicianship necessary, stunted any attempts at an actual revival. Mendelssohn took a careful eye to culling Bach's score down into something that was actually manageable. Mostly he did this by removing iterations of chorales that were entirely superfluous for his reasons. Now, the reason Bach included so many iterations of the same chorale was for overarching numerological and tonal reasons. But in order to actually get the thing heard and get the thing out there into the real world, Mendelssohn had to cut something, so the repeated stuff had to go. The two orchestras required in the St. Matthew Passion also played in a very early Romantic style, because the idea of historically informed performance practice really hadn't yet entered musical minds. Yet despite the deck being stacked against a successful production, it was such a rousing success that 1,000 Berliners had to be shunned at the door. Its enormous success brought Bach back to Germany, and eventually to Europe as a whole. His old teacher Zelter passed away in 1832, and Mendelssohn had his sights set on Zelter's old post, the director of the Berlin Sing Academy. But he did not get the post, as longtime assistant conductor Karl Rungenhagen got it instead. Mendelssohn didn't just take this as a slight against him, which it was. He saw it as an indictment of a conservative Berlin musical culture that did not want any semblance of innovation. So Mendelssohn went to Dusseldorf to become a music director there, and not only reintroduced the work of George Friedrich Handel as effectively as he had reintroduced Bach, but he actually introduced the idea of historically informed performance practice by having the continuo part played on the organ instead of being arranged for wind band, as Mozart had done. He also gained invaluable experience in conducting operas, beginning with an absolutely disastrous performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni. But disagreements led to his resignation from the post, and he left there to go to Leipzig, where he became the music director of the Gewandhaus Orchestra, which he found highly agreeable. It was in Leipzig that he met Robert Schumann, and the two composers held each other in very high esteem. At this point, Schumann was just getting his music criticism career going, and he and Mendelssohn hit it off. He also befriended the sickly Frédéric Chopin, whom he called the second Paganini. Odd, because even though Chopin was definitely a virtuoso, he wasn't the kind of flashy, exuberant performer that Paganini was. Also, Mendelssohn liked the music of both Chopin and Schumann, even though Chopin didn't think much of Schumann's music. Richard Wagner even thought highly of Mendelssohn, and clear Mendelssohnian traces can be seen in his early work. He even went so far as to send a copy of his early symphony in C major to Mendelssohn, but Mendelssohn did not respond. Mendelssohn not only brought the St. Matthew Passion back, he successfully revived the almost defunct genre of the oratorio, essentially an unstaged biblical opera. As a genre, it had lain mostly dormant since the deaths of Handel and Haydn, and he brought it back by writing St. Paul, something that combined aspects of both old and new. Mendelssohn was also instrumental, pardon the pun, in the first few performances of Franz Schubert's great C major symphony, his Ninth Symphony, and one of the longest symphonies theretofore composed. Although most people say that Schumann is the one who brought this work back because Schumann discovered it, we wouldn't be talking about it unless Mendelssohn had really promoted it as a conductor. He also accompanied solo violin works by Bach at the keyboard, basically turning them into short pieces that would be understood by a concert-going public who expected violin and piano instead of simply solo violin. He did this most famously with Bach's Chaconne in D minor, a very long, very engaging, very dark piece. This spurred on a great many other transcriptions of the Chaconne, which is a tradition that lasts to this day. In fact, the Chaconne is arguably one of the most transcribed pieces of classical music there is, and we can all link it back to its revival in sort of a strange accompanied version by Mendelssohn. Up until that point, the Chaconne was not played because there were very few violinists who had the technical capacity to play it, and those who thought it was playable by their standards didn't think it was worth it because they assumed that the public wouldn't understand it. Oh, how times have changed. His existence as composer, conductor, arranger, organist, pianist, violinist, and musicologist meant that he was pulled in every single direction, and he seemingly never slept. Mendelssohn traveled furiously over the continent to different engagements, and likewise he wrote furiously, from part songs and choruses to appeal to a burgeoning middle class, to studies for a weird and now defunct instrument known as the pedal piano. He once put off writing an overture for several months, before writing it in 3 days. He could effortlessly recall the specific errors made by his students, or improvise on melodies he had heard just one time a decade or more prior. All this musical activity led him to have a stroke. But this didn't stop him. In fact, he was up and at it again within 2 weeks. His next project was the establishment of a conservatory, originally intended for Leipzig. But political pettiness on the part of royalty snagged these efforts, and a better offer for the equivalent position in Berlin opened up. While Mendelssohn had had his fair share of issues with Berlin's musical culture, most of his extended family was there, and so he gladly went, only to find that the conservatory he was supposed to run didn't actually exist. He thus began a miserable existence in a Berlin that still seemed to shun him, and he escaped its borders for Leipzig or London at every chance he could get. While in London, he performed for Queen Victoria, who sang several of his songs, so well in fact that Mendelssohn actually divulged their true author, Fanny. He eventually reached a deal in Berlin whereby he could freely travel, which he took great advantage of. One of Mendelssohn's great instrumental masterpieces of this era is the Violin Concerto, which introduced several novel innovations in form and influenced the entire next generation of concerto composers. At the same time, he assembled various organ pieces into what he called organ sonatas. These harken back to Bach not only in their instrumentation, as solo organ was not really something that most composers scored for unless they were an organ specialist in that era, but by using the Baroque conceptualization of the sonata. At no point during any of his organ sonatas does Mendelssohn make use of what we know as sonata form. Finally, he was freed from the shackles of Berlin, and he was free to travel back around Europe, especially Leipzig. But this began to take a toll on him. His friends noted how gaunt he looked, and how tired he looked, and how he was always pushing himself. Wagner, who had initially been cordial to Mendelssohn, now turned on him for good, after the Leipzig press tore into the Tannhäuser Overture after Mendelssohn conducted it. For what it's worth, Wagner's virulent anti-Semitism probably played more than a small role in his final step towards becoming an anti-Mendelssohnian. Although still in search of an opera libretto, Mendelssohn now turned his attention back to the genre of the oratorio, something he hadn't touched since his earlier St. Paul. Now he felt ready to take up the challenge of writing something truly dramatic in that form. The resulting product was actually the return to a long-abandoned product in the form of Elijah. His Handel scholarship had helped his understanding of the oratorio as a fundamentally dramatic musical genre. The resulting music was so electric that the piece was immediately and nearly universally regarded as the greatest piece ever, or at least of that age. Ever the perfectionist, Mendelssohn tinkered with the piece significantly prior to its publication. Its Old Testament roots provide the basis for musicological arguments that try to link Mendelssohn with the faith of his ancestors. However, again, there is no evidence that Mendelssohn ever practiced Judaism, or even ever set foot in a synagogue. In fact, while heavily rooted in the Old Testament, it contains significant elements of Lutheran theology that tie it into the New. He began on-again, off-again work on an opera, and began drafting a third oratorio which seemed to involve Jesus. However, tragedy struck when Fanny suddenly died of a stroke. He worked somberly on various pieces, but his friends said that his personality had changed irreversibly towards the morose. He endured a succession of smaller strokes, passing away at the age of 38. Mendelssohn is often seen as a symbol of sweetness and purity in music, but his personality was actually far from it. He was described as always bubbling over, like champagne in a small glass. His perfectionism manifested itself in relentless revisions of earlier pieces, and it definitely informed what he expected of the orchestras he led. For a time after his death, he was counted amongst the truly great composers, but his legacy has endured much, specifically at the hands of the Nazis. But doubtless he remains one of the most profound prodigies who ever lived.